And I would love to know where everyone is coming in from. So as we are waiting for people to connect, if you could put in the chat box where you are geographically in the world to know where people are coming in, that would be great. So we can see all of the diversity that we have on our call today. I see that we have lots of people already sharing. We have many participants across the United States and US territories, Colorado, Texas. We have Fayetteville, Arkansas. We have many Zoomers from Canada, Ottawa, Halifax. We have the suburbs of Philly. We have a few joining us from Europe. We have the West Fjords in Iceland, the Lake District in the UK. We have Germany, Sweden, lots and lots of different places. Hello, everyone who has just connected. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Victoria Herman, and I am the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute and will be the moderator for our event. Today, we are hearing from two incredible experts who will present their experiences and research. We will have about an hour and a half today. And if you are unable to stay for the full time, don't worry, we are recording this session and will provide a link to the recording in our follow-up email. If you have any challenges with Zoom or your connection during this event, please either email me, provide a question in the chat box, or direct message me, and I will do my best to support you. We will first be hearing from Victoria and then Tiana, but if you have questions throughout the presentations today, please put those questions in the chat box throughout the presentations. I will be monitoring that chat and copying down those questions because we will have plenty of time after the presentations to get to all of your questions and have a really great discussion today about what is being shared. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to our first presenter today, Victoria Koktuk-Bushman, who is an Inuit wildlife and conservation biologist. She is currently finishing her PhD at the University of Washington, but she currently sits full-time at the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources in Nuuk. Today, she is presenting Co-Producing Arctic Conservation with Indigenous Communities. I'm going to hand over my virtual mic to you, Victoria. And again, if you have questions during the presentation, please type those in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen. Bear with me for a second. Is it good? Perfect. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. And I'm actually really happy that Tiana is presenting with me because we've had a professional friendship for the last few years, and I'm always really excited to see her. So I think we're going to have a really nice discussion this afternoon. For me, it's afternoon. So, like Victoria had said, I'm Inuit, which is Inuit, originally from the hometown of Utqiagvik, Alaska, which is in the very northernmost part of Alaska. But I do live full-time now in Nuuk, in Greenland, and I've had a lot of opportunities to live in other parts of the Arctic as well as part of my studies and sort of my personal professional development. I am finishing my PhD, very hopefully at the end of this year, once I get all of my publications out. But a little bit about my background before I get to this presentation. I've worked in Arctic research for the last 15 years. I got my first start working with seals and sea lions, research doing seals and sea lions for several years before I moved on to the Bear Arctic Science Consortium. And since then, I've been working exclusively in the Arctic. And I have a very special agreement with my university that allows me to live full-time in the North, even though my university is in Seattle. So I've lived abroad for the last 3 years in the North, doing the work in the communities that I feel like are very important and that needs to occur here. So today what I'm going to be talking to you about is sort of my research child of the last 6 years. I focused a lot on conservation, specifically because growing up, for me, conservation has always been a concept that is embedded within Indigenous worldviews. It's something that just makes sense. Everything about our values encourages us to live life as sustainably as possible. And those values really take to heart the concepts of conservation. But what I have always felt is that conservation is often practiced in a way that does not embody our worldviews. And there's a mismatch between how we believe that conservation, as Indigenous peoples, we believe conservation should be practiced and what actually happens on the ground. And so I wanted to take this great idea, this great concept, and look at why so many Indigenous communities still suffer some of the negative impacts of conservation, and not just focusing on what's bad, but figuring out where we're doing it really well, how we can do it really well, and how we can forward to other people these methodologies about how do we do it really, really well. And so today I'm going to be presenting to you two specific things, two things that have come out of my research. One is going to be a little bit about on-the-ground field research practice. What can we find really concretely? And the second is sort of this concept that I've been putting together for the last 6 years, where the co-production of knowledge is talked about a lot, but we're not really talking so much about how we co-produce services with that knowledge. And so co-productive conservation for me is this idea that has come out of my research. And I'm really excited to share it with you today because this is something that, like, while we're beginning to talk about within Indigenous organizations and governments and workshops and working groups within the United Nations and the Arctic Council and things like that, it's not something that's really that prevalent within the research, with the exception of a lot of really, really good research that's coming out of Canada right now. But this is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So, according to me, I live in the most beautiful part of the world, and I wouldn't give it up for anything, which is why I still live in the North. Conservation for me is not just about creating protected areas. It's not just about imposing management regulations. Conservation is a concept and a way of life that we've been practicing for thousands of years. It's not just protected areas. It's not just wildlife regulation and management and natural resource extraction and balancing these things. Conservation is also, it's also ecologies. It's looking at a holistic landscape and all of the moving pieces. And it's about recognizing that people live here and that we're a part of this ecosystem and a part of this process. So while you can sit here and look at this beautiful lake with some caribou bones, what I'm seeing is that this is a landscape that people use all the time. And this is a landscape that there are many species. And it's a landscape where we have not just regulations that manage those species, laws that say how we can and can't hunt these species, but it also is land that we can impose different sanctions that are along the lines of protected areas. This is here in Greenland. So this is just a little bit more about my background. I've been pretty much in the same field for the last 15 years. I studied conservation biology at Middlebury College, and I have one master's in wildlife science and one in environmental policy. So I do a lot of conservation in practice type work. So I used to do a lot of work with field studies, with wildlife field studies, and worked a lot with different species, small mammal sampling, electrofishing, different kinds of things. But these days I mostly work in the international policy space because I feel like within my role in research is really to challenge how conservation is practiced, not just doing the research on the ground anymore. But I do have a background in that. And so a lot of my insight comes from sort of this long story that I have been producing for myself, I suppose. This is my family. I think Indigenous peoples are becoming a really important part of research right now. We're in a really exciting time where our peoples are sort of centerfold in a lot of work that's going on in the Arctic, and this has not really been the case before. And so we're in this new frontier where we're trying to figure out how to do things in as ethically conscious, culturally relevant, and knowledge-based as possible. And there are a few reasons that Indigenous peoples are really important in this exact moment. Over the last 50 years, we've really been seeing a lot of environmental impacts to the Indigenous livelihoods represented all across the Arctic. A lot of this has to do with declines in the species that we hunt and fish. It has been a large part of food insecurity that has occurred across the Arctic. And it has captured the imagination of the general population all across the world. The Arctic is a hot topic. People care, people think about polar bears. And it's only been very recently that we think about the people who live within these spaces and why it's important to consider people within these spaces. And this has a lot to do with how we practice conservation, because historically conservation has been an action that has been very natural resources based. It has been based on this idea that everything could be found in the realm of the natural sciences with no consideration for the human dimensions of conservation or any kind of management, and without consideration for how policy shapes how we do things. It's not just what we want to do in research, it's also how we apply that in policy and how we encourage people to be socially engaged within that policy. And so Indigenous peoples are becoming a really important part of this. And I'm sure that I don't really need to explain that very much because it's very prevalent in all of the work that is happening right now. But I really do firmly believe that this is the time now to be exploring these kinds of concepts, and it's a very exciting time. This is what I do in short. I spend my time running all over the Arctic before Corona, of course. I've worked in all 8 of the Arctic countries, where I do visit, study, and assess Arctic protected areas. So I've been to many, many dozens of protected areas all across the Arctic in all of the Arctic countries. I follow and evaluate wildlife management regulations. So it's important for me to know what is going on within the Arctic, within conservation, and I make it my personal business to know what's happening all across the North. So not only what's happening in the Arctic Council and the UN, but like what new exciting Indigenous-led conservation projects and programs are happening across the North. What kinds of new legislation is being introduced in Norway or Finland or something like this that will have an impact on Indigenous communities and of course on wildlife populations. And the third kind of side of my research that I really focus on is that I do spend a lot of time with people. Often when I am visiting a country, I go immediately out into the small communities. Of course, this is all before coronavirus. I haven't left the country in like a year because it's very difficult to leave Greenland right now. But usually I spend a lot of time with hunters and fishers. I go out and shadow them for usually like 8 to 12 hours at a time. And we chat and we talk about not only what they're doing and sort of the methods and the Indigenous knowledge that is related to what they're doing, but also how they feel and perceive the different conservation strategies that are being employed in that particular place. So the reason that I focus on all of these things is because I find it very important to connect very local place-based activities to these big international policies and having an idea of how these feed into these big international policies. So I can't say that I do one specific thing, right? I do a little bit of a lot of things. And I think that this is very much in line with Indigenous worldviews and methodologies that things need to be very holistic. I've been always trained as a natural scientist. I've never been a social scientist, but I focus on the human dimensions of natural science. And I do have a policy degree, so I end up focusing on conservation in practice, which is not really social science, but it is how we move beyond science into actualizing what we desire. This is actually a picture that I took this summer on one of our hunting trips in Umnivit. It's a very popular place to go hunting for caribou in ptarmigan. So why does any of this matter, right? So I'm sure I don't need to explain why conservation is important, because so many people feel like, we love to go to national parks. We love thinking that there are strategies in place that help protect nature from people. And these are very true things. I think also there is a greater recognition that Indigenous peoples are such a positive aspect of this whole process, and we have a very positive influence on conservation in this era. I happen to be in this place, Talaritiapamanga, in Canada, in Nunavut, 2 years ago when it was formally designated by Canada. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau flew out to Arctic Bay, and we were in that community when he gave the formal declaration that Inuit in Nunavut had helped to shape this protected area, and it had propelled Canada to its 17% goal of protected areas under their United Nations SWGs. No, Sustainable Development. Yeah, SDGs. This was a phenomenal protected area, and I'm showing it to you now because I would really like to focus for a second on how Indigenous communities in the Arctic are really not only like very much involved in conservation, but are often pushing for conservation in ways that nobody has ever pushed for conservation before. And we're making huge gains in these areas, and it's not really recognized. So this protected area is massive. It's very large and takes up much of the waterways in the Northwest Passage. And it is a beautiful area. And Indigenous communities, specifically Inuit and Nunavut, have been using these spaces for millennia. And the reason that it was pushed for by these communities is because it is a way of protecting these spaces from increased shipping, from increased mineral extraction, from increased interest in fisheries development. There are a lot of reasons that our communities are also interested in being involved in these processes. If we look at Canada, we can see that actually we have a really good chance of doing good stuff when we do it together. This is also another picture from Umnivit. This is not a protected area, but this is a space in which reindeer management can be quite contentious. And the social regulation plays a really important role in how people are hunting in these places. Greenland is one of those places, like many places in Inuit homelands, where you use all of the animal. And so while there are laws that say you have to take everything when you hunt something, it's really the social regulation that keeps people in line, because it follows our worldviews to ensure that when we hunt, we're taking everything. We're walking up into these big mountains and we're carrying the entire body all the way back down to the boat. And this can be many, many kilometers. But we do it because 1, it's tradition, 2, we know it's the right thing to do, and 3, it is part of our Indigenous concepts of conservation and how we practice conservation every day. So I've mentioned this a little bit before, but I'm going to take you through a little bit of the trajectory of conservation and how it has sort of unfolded mostly in the United States, but globally as well. Conservation planning, which includes everything from the development and establishment of new protected areas, existing protected areas, and the management and conservation of natural spaces and wildlife species, has gone through huge leaps and bounds in the last 100 years, and especially in the last 20 years. It used to be just the domain of the natural sciences. And then we started thinking about the social and institutional dimensions. So getting it through the different political channels that was required to enact conservation, and to make sure that people were okay with what the government was proposing, because usually these conservation projects, at least in the US, used to be very government-led. The next was the recognition of conservation as a social process. So you can't really get much done if people don't believe in the laws and the management and the policies that you're putting forth. So it's really important to have people on board when you're proposing different kinds of conservation efforts. It doesn't seem that revolutionary, but at the time it was very revolutionary. This was maybe in the late 1980s that people started talking about this. Then there was stakeholder-driven conservation. So the people who are impacted by the conservation efforts need to be involved in the conservation processes. And then it was the inclusion of the human dimensions of conservation. So this is thinking about the social impacts of conservation, the economic impacts of conservation. And slowly we're building this really robust idea of how we practice conservation. And I'm proposing that we're really in a space right now where we're working towards decolonizing conservation. And I bring this up because just today I read something that was talking about green colonialism, or you might hear phrases like conservation as the new colonialism. And it is something that happens in different parts of the world, and Indigenous communities are impacted by conservation efforts. What we really need to work towards as a population is ensuring that conservation is standing on these three foundational pillars that I like to say, which is it has to be ethically conscious, it has to be culturally relevant, and it has to be knowledge-based. And the reasons that we're not always getting towards these spaces is because sometimes conservation efforts are not ethical. If we are using information to hurt Indigenous communities and to make them criminals on their own homelands, this is not ethical. If it's not culturally relevant, then management might inhibit Indigenous communities from achieving food security. And you can't starve out people by imposing conservation regulations. We have to develop solutions that are culturally applicable. And the third is knowledge-based, and often in conservation, Indigenous knowledge is not being used. Of course, this is becoming more and more of a reality, but these three things are the three things that you really need in order to have a really, in my eyes, successful conservation process. So I'm going to take you through these two things. One is more of a field-based, some field-based conclusions that came out of this research. And then I'll take you through some of the conceptual stuff that we are proposing, that I am proposing as a way to move forward in conservation. I spent a year working at the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, which is the biodiversity working group of the Arctic Council. I was there as a Fulbright NSF Arctic Research Fellow in 2018 and 2019. And part of what I was doing with them was the development of one of their first Indigenous-centered sort of research projects. And so I was working a little bit in wetlands resources because 60% of the Arctic is actually wetlands. It's a significant chunk. And this is often where we find some of the highest biodiversity in the Arctic are in our wetland ecosystems, if we're not talking about marine. So I ended up doing this study called the Arctic Wetlands and Indigenous People Study. I'm calling it AWIPS for short. And it is the first circumpolar assessment of how Indigenous communities are engaged in the development and management of protected areas in the Arctic. So we're going to look at just a couple of different conclusions and things to set up what I'm going to be proposing to you in a minute. So we looked at 35 protected areas all across the Arctic, including in a few places that do not have Indigenous communities, but where I have lived and also find, for instance, in Iceland and in the Faroe Islands, where people have a lot of local knowledge and have sort of a different worldview about nature as well. So, of course, I felt happy to include these as part of the study, with, of course, a small asterisk in there that it's not quite the same. But these were the 35 areas all across the Arctic. You'll find them concentrated in Europe just because there's smaller spaces in the Arctic countries, in the European countries. Many more protected areas. They're not very big. And then we have these massive protected areas in the other parts of the Arctic. This, of course, represented many different Indigenous, not just communities, but Indigenous groups. So there is a lot of worldview, a lot of cultural difference within these Indigenous spaces as well, but fully circumpolar. From this study of these 35 protected areas, we were able to learn that Indigenous communities are using up to 82.9% of the surveyed protected areas for subsistence use. So this is the use of animals and spaces for food security, essentially. This is a little bit unprecedented because when we look at these management and conservation plans, you don't see this, right? We don't see that Indigenous communities are using these spaces. It's not always true. It's written into conservation and management plans in Alaska and in Canada, but we're not seeing how much Indigenous communities are really using these spaces and to what extent we really rely on them. So this is a little bit significant. It's the first time that we've been able to really look and see protected areas. Yes, we think of them as spaces where people aren't, but the truth is Indigenous communities are using a lot of them. And then we were also looking at Indigenous representation. So essentially, we have these protected areas, but who owns them and who manages them? And you might be surprised and you might be unsurprised to learn that Indigenous communities have maybe between 1/3 and 1/4, about 1/3 and 1/4 of these protected areas, they had some sort of management authority. So the ability to help make decisions for those spaces. So while we're using roughly 80%-ish of all of these spaces, we really only have the ability to control decisions within about 25 to 30% of them. And one thing that we also learned is that when we're looking at these conservation and management plans, when we go to these spaces, there is no documentation of Indigenous communities using resources. I'm generalizing a little bit. I keep having to go back and say, in Canada, it is a little bit better. There are more references in a lot of the Canadian conservation and management plans, especially in Inuit homelands. But what we're not documenting is what species are people using? How much do people rely on these species? What species are of Indigenous concern, not just at a global level, but what is locally important to people and what are people concerned about? These kinds of things we don't find in management plans. And I don't mean to push this as a way of further controlling how Indigenous communities use these things. But when we approach conservation and we're trying to build a system that supports a system, we need to know all of the information so that we can ensure that we're not unnecessarily inhibiting Indigenous communities from achieving their food security, or we're overlooking something that is locally really important that from a global conservation perspective, we're not seeing. It's not part of our SDGs, so it's not important to us when we develop a conservation plan. But what if it's really important to a community that's on the ground and they're really interested in learning more about this, or they have a proposition for how to manage that species or space in a different way that we haven't thought about before. This lack of information is a knowledge gap. And in conservation, which is a crisis-based discipline, we really do need as much information as possible. And it's really important for us to ensure that we are also paying attention to Indigenous perspectives and needs and concerns within conservation processes. And the last thing is that in looking through all these conservation and management plans and looking at all of the red listed species and accounting for all of the species that are in these spaces, conservation actually really suffers when we're not considering also Indigenous perspectives and we're not considering these place-based perspectives of how we go about building a management strategy. And when I talk about management strategies, I don't just mean for a particular species, right? We're looking at sort of an ecosystem level. Like we're looking at a very holistic big picture. We're managing beluga here, and we're managing different species of whale here, and seals and walrus. But all of that has to come together as a conservation strategy because that is a fully functioning ecosystem. And by including more Indigenous perspectives, we can make decisions that respect and accommodate Indigenous uses of space. So I just wanted to share a little bit about fieldwork. So I don't just sit in an office and read conservation and management plans all the time, although it does feel that way sometimes. But I do also work in the field, go to different places and talk with people about hunting, both by dog sled, but also the tourism aspect of that, because they are very interrelated. This is in Sarfongwat in Greenland, which is within the Asavisuit Nipissat UNESCO World Heritage Site. There is actually a community within this World Heritage Site, and it is a beautiful space that has been used for, I think, 4,000 years, not just by Inuit, but of course by other Arctic peoples who no longer are here in Greenland. But it's a really important area that people live. And as you can see on the table, we're sitting in somebody's house talking about different hunting practices that are going on, what they're seeing, what the differences are, what are they concerned about, and under threat of climate change, whether they believe it's real, what they feel about. We talk about all kinds of different things when I go into communities and sit with people. And I think that this is a really nice way to have conversations with community members and to get a really good idea of how it is on the ground. This is in Iceland. This is Mývatn, which is a migratory bird sanctuary in North Iceland. This is in Svolvær in Norway, where there are a lot of discussions around offshore oil drilling and both small scale and large scale cod fisheries. There are some Indigenous communities a little bit north of there that also have these concerns. This is in Sermelik National Park. Was there in 2019 with some students, with the Students on Ice program, which is a Canadian expeditionary program that I highly recommend. But you start to get a feel as you go through all of these places in the Arctic that the truth is we have a lot of the same issues. Indigenous communities are all experiencing a lot of the same issues, which leads you to believe that there is a way to propose sort of a circumpolar perspective on how we can approach this, how we can improve some of the situations that are around conservation. So really briefly, I'm just going to share what I've been developing over the last 6 years, which is this idea of coproductive conservation. So it's a combination of the co-production of knowledge, which is talked about quite often now. It has about, it's become very popular in the last 5 years, but there's also this idea of the co-production of public services. And I don't mean to become all technical and academic, but these two things, the co-production of knowledge and the co-production of public services, is essentially what we do in conservation. We're doing this research, we want to turn this research into policy, and that policy is then public services and the development of protected areas in management and regulation, like it's very much a government, kind of a government activity. And so when you combine these two concepts, we get these 6 ideas of things that co-productive conservation can revolve around. When we're working with Indigenous communities and we're working in Arctic spaces, I'm not going to say that I think this will work anywhere else because I don't have a lot of experience in places that aren't in the Arctic. But what I see is when we're doing conservation with Indigenous communities, these 6 things need to happen. We need to engage in co-planning. We need to engage in co-prioritizing, co-learning. This is an important step because this is really where the co-production of knowledge comes from. Co-management, co-delivering, and co-assessing. And these are not meant to be in any particular order. This is a very iterative and reflexive process. But the reason that co is sort of put in all of these spaces is because I think sometimes we need a reminder that when we're practicing conservation, we need to be doing these things together from the very beginning, from inception through the development of whatever's going to happen to the execution of what's happening. And I'm going to show, unfortunately, this is a very horribly large graph, and I'll leave it here while I chat about things. This is sort of the expanded version of what I just showed. This is showing that we have a lot of stuff to do when it comes to conservation, and there's a lot of steps that we need to make sure that we're doing together. We can focus on the centerpiece, coproductive conservation. This is the foundation that we need. We have to commit to co-producing conservation, which means that we're committing to a lens that is ethically conscious, culturally relevant, and fully knowledge-based. And there are 6 processes that we need to focus on. Like I just said, co-planning, co-prioritizing, co-learning, co-managing, co-delivering, and co-assessing. And then in this next outer ring, we can see sort of like, well, what does that mean? What are we doing when we're co-planning? This is the stage where we're conceptualizing projects, we're scoping projects, we're looking for funding for those projects, we're identifying the experts of those projects. Co-prioritizing is figuring out, okay, well, what do we want to do about this problem that we have? How do we want to develop a community around this to tackle these problems? At what scales are we going to do this at? Co-learning, which is where we develop a shared evidence base. So this is incorporating science and Indigenous knowledge in a way where we're learning together and we're getting everybody on the same page. Co-managing, which is co-management is not an uncommon concept, right? And so this is where we're delineating, allocating, and regulating different things. There's the co-delivering. So this is sort of the really big co-production of public services push. So how are we doing the enforcement of those spaces? How are we contributing to that research? How are we educating about what is happening within this conservation effort? And then there's co-assessing, which I'm saying this in a particular order, but there's not really a particular order. This is the assessment and evaluation and reporting and communication of the conservation effort. And there's a lot of really, there's a lot of nuance here, and there's a lot of really specific things that you can do around these things. So I apologize if it feels like a little bit amorphous. The outer ring are specific examples of like, well, what does that look like? Like, how exactly does that work in a conservation process? Things like understanding governance structures. in the co-planning section is figuring out indigenous government structures and committing to working in those governance structures, even if they're not required by law. It's identifying engagement methodologies. So Indigenous communities have engagement methodologies, and we don't all like to call them methodologies, they're approaches to engagement. Figuring out how to work with Indigenous communities in some of these spaces and committing to maybe even developing things like participation plans, not just management and conservation plans, but participation plans that show us this is the direction we want to go as we develop a conservation process together. There's a lot of stuff here. I am really trying to get this published right now. I haven't sent it out for publication yet, just because I feel like I've been sitting on it for 6 years and I want it to be very good, but I'm happy to talk about all of this a little bit more. I do want to be respectful of our time. And then I would like to leave, I think, with again, a revisitation of why we're doing this at all. There are 7 things that I think come out of coproductive conservation. One is that we improve the collaboration around conservation projects. We want everybody to be on board with what we're doing. We want to propose solutions that are fair and just and meaningful for everybody. We want it to be stakeholder driven. Stakeholder driven is sort of the word that's just used, but often in Indigenous homelands, we have to talk about being rights holder driven. So these are the people who have the rights to these spaces and have, of course, should have a say in how things are managed. It allows us to get more time critical information, which is very necessary in conservation. We're learning basic things about basic biology all of the time here in the Arctic, because whether we like it or not, we're still a relatively data deficient region. It fosters co-management. And that's because if we develop a conservation project from conception, then we can all be on board and know how to co-manage it equally and equitably later in the process. It improves biodiversity and culture because it is enabling us to engage in ways that are culturally relevant. And of course, Indigenous communities are often sort of our first responders to a lot of the climate change impacts and biodiversity loss impacts and things like this. And so we want things to be, we want conservation efforts to make sense to the people who have to live with those regulations. It also ensures that our conservation efforts are both place-based and landscape scale. So like I was saying, really small on the ground, local, but also feeding into these sort of global conservation targets and goals that are set forth by the United Nations, Arctic Council, and other big international fora. And then the last one is that it really does help us how we evaluate and apply conservation efforts and different information. It helps us to figure out whether or not our conservation efforts are really truly being successful, or if they're just successful on paper. And I'm just going to leave you with a picture of Umanak, which is really beautiful, and my acknowledgements for my dissertation. But I'm really happy. I don't know, I'll let Victoria decide what we're doing, but thank you so much for listening, and I do look forward to chatting about this more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. If everyone could give a virtual round of applause to Victoria, either on your video or just at home or at your office if you are not on video. We are going to wait until after our second presenter for question and answer so we can bring both of our speakers back on screen. So not to waste any time, we are going to now invite our second speaker for her presentation. Dr. Tayana Aracha is a cultural anthropologist and Indigenous scholar, and she has worked for 10 years at the Tuvan State University, and she'll be presenting on Tajou reindeer herder hunters in the Siberian taiga. And Tayana, I'm going to ask for you to come on, and I will highlight your video so you can present. Again, if you have questions for either of our speakers, please put those in the chat box and we will get to them after Tayana's presentation.
Okay, so I need to share my screen. Okay, I'm kind of lost. I have to, sorry. Can you see this?
We cannot yet see your screen. Now we can.
Okay. So now I'm taking you to Siberia, to a very remote community. Okay. So I will talk about the Tajou reindeer herder hunters who live in the Siberian taiga in the Republic of Tuva. And I am from the Republic of Tuva originally. So I conducted, okay, how I should do. Okay, so I would like to show you on the map where is Tuva, the Tuva Republic is located. I'm sorry, guys, this map is in Russian, but it's a really good map to show. If you can see on my cursor, it's located in the southern Siberia. It's a small province, and in the south it borders with Mongolia. So I will talk about my PhD dissertation research. I conducted research in the northern part of Tuva, in the Tajou district. That's where the Tajou reindeer herder hunters live. And the majority of them live in Aderkajik village. I mean that they are from this village because they still houses and families there. But today they mostly their reindeer herding camps located here at the Yenisei River, and here we see Academic Obruchev mountain range. And I'm originally from the capital of the Tuva, Kazil. So I would like to give a short introduction about the Tajou people. In 1991, the Tajou were officially recognized as Tiva Tajou, Tuvinci, a small number people of the North Siberia and the Far East. According to the Russian census of 2010, the Tajou population was about 2,000, but actually the number should be about 4,000 because the problem is that when the census was done, half of them chose the Tiva. This is the name of the ethnicity. But when I speak in English, I say Tuva because there is no such sound E, and for me it's easy to say Tuva when I speak in English. So they chose Tuva, and that's why they remained half of the population remained undercounted. And they have different ancestors, and they spoke in different language. By the end of the 19th century, they adopted Tuvan language, and today they identify themselves as a Tuva who live in the Tajou district. In 2015, 35 people were actively engaged in hunting and reindeer herding with about 3,000 reindeer. But again, this actual number is less because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all collective farms disappeared because the Tajou were part of these collective farms, and now they live traditional way of life. They don't receive any salaries. That's why the government financially supports them, pay subsidies for every reindeer, and that's why they put a higher number. And I cannot blame them, well, because this life is really difficult and challenging, especially when they live in such a challenging environment. And in 2019, 1,800 reindeer were counted. The Tajou practice vertical migration. in the summer, they go to the tops of the mountains because it's cooler there and windy. It's good for reindeer because in summer temperature gets really high if they stay in the valleys. So it's less mosquitoes. And the whole area is called the taiga, what you see here in the picture. And this word actually came from my region, and I'm proud of it. And it came to Russian language, and later it became internationally known as the Boreal Forest. But the main meaning is a mountain boreal forest, a rich forest, what you can see here in the picture. And the second meaning is unforested mountain peak above tree line covered by snow or some patches of snow in summertime. Here you see on this picture, but when I was in 2012, due to the climate change, all these snow patches melted. And they told me it was the first time when snow patches melted. So in the fall, they go down. So they come from one taiga to another taiga. So they come to the forest. And in winter, they live in log cabins. The number of the reindeer, the herd is really small. It ranges from 30 to 60 reindeer. Reindeer are used for transportation. Also, they milk them and make milk products. So this number is optimal, is enough for them. Even the government tries them to enlarge the number because the government, of course, interested in meat-oriented production, but they are hunters. And in the ethnographic literature, they describe as hunters on reindeer. As they said, if they will have bigger number of reindeer, they will not have time to hunt. And they need to hunt because this is the only one economic activity that brings them money, cash, and they hunt sables. What you see in the picture in the US, it's called marting. And this is commercial hunting, which starts in November. Sable is considered as a national symbol of Russia. And it's also called soft gold. And in the end of December, they switch, they hunt musk deer. You see here on the picture. This is the smallest deer in Eurasia. And they hunt deer, musk deer for musk deer glands, which you see on the picture, and you can obtain these glands only from adult male deer. And these glands are highly valued in Asian folk medicine. And thanks to French, also glands are used in perfume industry. And this is the most expensive animal product, but you can extract only a few grams from these glands. So until recently, anthropological studies tend to present reindeer as the only key animal for Siberian taiga peoples, overlooking the roles of dogs and horses. However, both are also vital partners in daily life for the Tajou reindeer herder hunters. And today, in recent years, what I see are people begin to do multi-species ethnography. They begin to pay attention to the important role of other animals, as I said, like dogs and horses. And Tajou, also each household has 2 or 3 horses, and they use these horses in summer to go to the villages because they have families and they have some errands to do in the villages because, as I said, they have families. So they use them like for half of the year, from the spring to the late fall. So one of the striking behavioral and technological breakthroughs of modern humans emerged from modeling wolves hunting style. So indigenous people who live in southern Siberia, they consider wolves as their progenitors, and also they consider them as first instructors who taught humans to hunt. So if we consider a herder hunter as a wolf, lacking strong jaws, crushing teeth, fast legs, sharp vision, good hearing, and scent, this wolf has to cooperate with other pack members, dogs, to take down large prey which might flee from him. Like in the wolf pack, the wolf as a leader defines a role for each pack member, and all members work as a team with minimum communication. They understand each other and collaborate so effectively that the pack becomes a highly performing team. So the wolf pack approach suggests that herder hunters mimic wolf hunting behavior while relying on dogs' abilities to track and capture their prey. The Tajou recognize dogs as being natural hunters and pack members who must be controlled by a human, acting as an ultimate pack leader, guiding to the behavior of the dogs. So what they do, dogs, they find the right animal, chase it over long distance, surround it, and give a signal by barking. So the pack leader comes and kills what you see in the picture. So the dog gave a signal to the master, and the master killed sable. Here you see hunting dogs. This is indigenous breed, and it is called in Tajou district Tajun Laika, which is Tuvan Laika, and it is officially recognized as the East Siberian Laika. And what is unique about this breed is this actually a masterpiece of the taiga that humans created because it combines the features of scent hounds, sight hounds, and buck pointers. And this is the only one among all hunting breeds that hunts all game, including small game and big game, because other hunting dogs, they hunt either small game or big game. So these dogs are considered multi-purpose dogs, but because dogs have different personalities and gender differences, in real life, some dogs tend to hunt only small game or big game. So even they're supposed to be multi-purpose dogs. And for me, it was interesting to compare like hunting dogs, particularly in the forest, because today indigenous people only in 2 regions use hunting dogs as for their service, only in southern Siberia, reindeer herder hunters, and in South America, in Amazonia, in jungles, indigenous people also use hunting dogs. So for me, it was interesting to compare their hunting dogs and the Tajou case. So in Amazonia, what I've read that they are hunting dogs, like, for example, only males can be pack leaders, but in the Tajou case, it's different. Both male and females can be pack leaders. So there is no difference. And this environment is really tough. It's a cold, and they hunt all the time because the Tajou, they hunt for subsistence and for commercial hunting. And of course, they support their natural hunting instincts. and they consider dogs as their hunting partners. When I talk to the elders, when I ask them about the features of the Tajou laika, what they always told me is that today Tajou laika is hainaktar. It means mixture or mixed bloods. So they are mixed due to the Russian influx. Because Russians brought their own dogs and Tajou like a mix, but the main reason why they were mixed also, it was the government politics. They purposely mixed Tajou like with the West Siberian laika. It's another breed from Western Siberia, and it's considered gold standard, and it's really promoted by laika expert and dog breeders, and Tuvan laika or East Siberian laika is considered as mongrels, and it's actually it became a symbol of indigenous people, while West Siberian laika became a symbol of Slavic population who reads about breeds and breed standards and follow these and try to buy, to obtain purebred like us. Here in the picture you see the Tajou laika in 1960s. This is Champion, and as you see, this dog is strongly built, and the skull is big, and this contemporary, what I took in 2015, they look kind of similar, but this dog is not so robust. I saw so many like us, but I didn't see like this old which is strong built and robust, and which was described actually in old literature. So the appearance of the dogs a little bit changed. So on these pictures you see fall hunting. The hunter is going to hunt. As I said, this is a really difficult environment, challenging, because it's hilly. I don't know why it's doing this. It's hilly and it's a lot of snow, and you see fallen trees, and also some tree roots is coming out from the land. In my dissertation, I argue that because of hunting with dogs was a stimulus to domesticate reindeer. Because it's impossible to keep up with dogs in winter to go through, especially to go through deep snow. And reindeer, they were not born to carry humans and loads. So the ancestors of the Tajou, they cultivated tameness for at least 10,000 years. So they begin to tame reindeer when they are born. They tie them like on the third, on the fourth day when they are born. And that's how reindeer become docile and become used to humans. When I came to my fieldwork, what I saw right away that I was the tallest woman in the village. And in every reindeer herding camp, I was the tallest woman. Even men were shorter than me. I've met only 2 men who were taller than me, but they were so skinny. I always felt that I'm a little bit chubby around these people. And also they told that my facial features are different than they have more prominent cheeks and more narrow eyes. But if you see, I look so huge compared to them. This is Nadia, my host, with whom I stayed in the village. But I'm not huge. My height is 1 meter 60 centimeters. And every time before I rode reindeer, people asked me, what is your weight? And And I was told that the ideal weight should be not more than 60 kilogram, and the reindeer is 200 kilogram and can carry a 60 kilogram, which I called 30% of the reindeer's weight, or 30% rule. And the optimal weight should be no more than 65 kilograms. And one day I was eating a candy, and female herder hunter told me, "Oh, you eat too many candies. That's why you're so fat." And in Tuvan language, it's semis, and there is only one word. There is no many words like in English, like overweight, extra kilograms, or like chubby, or maybe other words. It's just only one word, fat, semis, that's all. So of course it's not flattering to hear for a woman that she's fat, and and that it's such a rare field work when researchers' weight is so critical. So when I came the next time, I purposely lost 4 kilograms. I was 64 kilograms before this. So, and every time when I wrote Reindeer, one story came to my mind. I mean, when people ask me what is my weight, one story came to my mind. I never thought that it will somehow, this research somehow will be connected to my life, but I think it's kind of expected because I'm from Tuva. So this story happened to my ex-husband. When we lived in a neighboring province to Tajou district in Bihem, in a small town, my ex-husband was police. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the cattle stealing was a very common crime. And my ex was a policeman. His name is Orlan. And I remember in the fall of 1995, a few cows were stolen from the herd. And Orlan and his two colleagues were sent to the taiga on the horseback to find cattle rustlers. So when they penetrated the taiga deep, they finally reached a reindeer herding camp. They asked a family to stay for a night. And when it was time to go to bed, the host showed the place to sleep, but they told Orlan, there is no place for you. You need to go to another dwelling. At that time, they lived in traditional conical dwelling, which looks like a teepee. I will just say teepee. And it was covered by reindeer hides. So they told him, go to another teepee. There is a young girl with a toddler. She needs to have a son. So of course he was shocked by such a straightforward statement. He looked at his colleagues, who were silent, and of course they didn't want to be kicked out in the middle of the night. So he had to go to this teepee, and he was thinking about this awkward situation with the Tajou, who apparently were so different from the urban population he knew. Because he was on a mission to catch cattle rustlers, not to make a baby with a completely unknown woman. So when he came to the teepee, it was a young girl in her mid-20s. She showed him a place to sleep on a male side, and she went to sleep with the toddler on a female side. On the next morning, an old woman came to Arlan and she said, I'm so happy that you didn't sleep with the girl, because if she would carry a child, this child will have big bones. If when he will grow, he will ride a reindeer, and this he will be too heavy and he will break a reindeer back. So it will be disastrous for us to have such man in the camp. So what was Elda was trying to say is that that it was the weight is so important that even like big bones and like if the man is tall and have big bones, he's heavier than like a short man with a small bones. Here on the picture you see Alde Sergey. He's short, he's kind of petite, he's like much shorter than me, and he has small bones, and he's a really good rider. And this is very critical, the rider's weight, because they have to search for prey for all day riding reindeer. And of course, it's exhausting for an animal to carry a human, and particularly a heavy human. And a heavy human, as I said, can break reindeer back. So what I would like to say also that the Teva recognize the role of father as one who gives bones to a new child, whereas a mother creates meat and blood. So for the since the Tuvan groups were patrilineal societies, a male lineage or a clan was known as a Serk or Seok, bone, bony, breed, quality, meaning bone of the father. And I remember 20 years ago, some elders could ask, Slayer context, Dr. Slayer, it means they asked me, what is your, like, what your father's bone means, my father's clan. But today, I mean, not today, but during the Soviet era, the meaning of this question changed because clans and tribes were not already in use. It was all system, due to colonization, the system was destroyed. The first colonization, actually, the first colonizers were Chinese. They're the first one who destroyed this clan or tribal division. So this, the meaning of the question changed, and now it means what is your ethnicity. So nowadays nobody asks what is your belonging. Some elders still can ask, like just they ask what is your father's clan, but not like what is your bone of the father. But in the Tajou case, they believe that that the father not only creates the bones of a future child, but he creates a quality of bones, thin or thick bones. And what is interesting, when I told the story which happened to my ex-husband, we had a daughter, and she actually has big bones. She's wide-shouldered, and she's kind of plump. And the elder already foreseen what kind of child he will have. And I think in the past, elders probably, they, of course, they look at their daughter's future partners, weight, height. This is was very important because marriages between different clans, tribes, intermarriages were happened in the past. So the prolonged coexistence of humans and reindeer required adaptation from both sides. It wasn't only a one-way influence of humans on animals. Hunter-foragers were able to adapt to the reindeer morphology. The Tajou not only cultivated the docile reindeer, but they have also bred the largest reindeer in the world, and they also have adapted themselves as appropriately sized and trained riders. As a result of the long process of reproductive selection and a way of life, the Tajou have small bones, short height, and low body weight in general. And the last topic which I covered and which is I never talk about it is do Tajou women hunt? Studies on the Tajou usually portray hunting as a typical male activity and include only general descriptions of the division of labor by genders. Sylviane Weinstein, a leading authority who actually made a great contribution about domestication of reindeer in Siberia, points out that Tajou taboo barred women from hunting and fishing, and in Tuva in general, a deep conviction has held that women are supposed to give life, not to take it. And for me, this statement is really weird because I'm from Tuva, and everyone who is from Tuva, we know that Tajou women do hunt. And why it's weird for me, because before Weinstein, another Soviet ethnographer, Ekaterina Prokofieva, did research among these people, and she asserts that these women hunted small game, including squirrel. A woman with young children remained in the camp and hunted to provide the family with at least small game and birds, particularly in the winter months when other resources were not available. And they have to hunt because men, they went for commercial hunting and they could be gone for a month or two. And during Soviet era, collective farms strongly encouraged teenagers and women to participate in commercial hunting. Here in the picture, you see Onduma Ak, and she's recognized as the best female hunter, one of the best female hunters. And the collective farms provided reindeer, rifles, and you see, and she has a knife. And they were sent to the taiga for for several days, usually a week or maybe 10 days. And the team was of 4 or 5 people. The hunting return rates of small game and birds are higher than the rates of big game hunted by males. And another ethnographer who conducted research among Tafa, neighboring people, stated that taiga women hunted in the context in which hunting was more profitable than other economic activities. Women hunted because of the existing fur market in their area, and the most expensive fur on the Siberian market was sable, and the lowest priced was squirrel. And was much easier to kill 60 squirrels than to kill one sable. And here in the picture, you see also one of the best female hunter, Tenkime Ak. And during my fieldwork, I've met female hunters. Here in the picture in the middle, you see Saizana Cole. She was my host in the reindeer herding camp. And she actually learned to hunt in her middle 40s, and she became successful hunter. And her brother described that she's a good hunter and she hunts like a male. She's not, she's a good hunter. And I've met another woman in the village, Rosalia Homushku. She learned to hunt in her middle 30s while she lived in reindeer herding camp. And actually her female relative taught her to hunt. And usually children learn to hunt when they're at the age of 11, 12, from 10 to 12. So boys and girls, because they are equal at this age. But in these cases, we see that women can learn even later. And I also met an elder, Surkakchi Kol. When I interviewed her, I accidentally found out that she was also a hunter during the Soviet era, but she said that she wasn't the best hunter, so she was never recognized in collective farm reports or newspapers. And that's why villagers even don't know. When I talked to the villagers, they were so surprised that Surgakchi was a hunter. So now I think that's all what I wanted to tell. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your attention. And thank you for having me here.
Thank you so, so much, Tajana. And if everyone again could give a virtual round of applause wherever you are for such an incredible and a thorough presentation. We now have about 10-15 minutes for a question and answer session. I'm going to ask both of our presenters to come back onto the screen. And I am also going to ask our first participant, Alec, if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you both for the presentation. I wanted to ask Victoria, do you have a specific example of how a community has maybe put some of these co-production techniques to work? I ask, the first thing that came to mind is that in my experience in the Arctic, people are spending a lot of time out hunting or fishing or gathering or what have you. And I'm just wondering how, it seems like the process could break down if they're having to constantly be involved in these, all these different steps of the co-production process, which you highlighted. So I just was wondering how that's been actually navigated in real life. And if I could just have a quick question to Tajana. Tajana, спасибо большое за интересную лекцию. I've worked in Russia a bit, and I just wanted to ask if you saw any use of reindeer decoys being used in Tajou hunting, because I know that in a lot of the anthropological research, the Tajou are identified as kind of the start of the domestication of reindeer through their use of reindeer decoys, and I was wondering if that still happens. So thank you both.
Hi, thank you for your question. I can go first. This is a really good question, and I have a lot of points of advice. I would say first that within a conservation planning process, it is really important to recognize that Indigenous community members don't do these services for free, right? Like if you develop a position in a community as a conservation liaison or some other formal real work opportunity, then of course people have the time and attention and capacity to be a part of these processes. And it's actually a good idea because it helps to have sort of a direct connection to community members and have somebody who can help represent some of those perspectives and needs. The other is that there are lots of examples of really good co-management practices. The Northwest Arctic Borough in Alaska, their wildlife department is Indigenous led, and they are involved in all of the big conservation efforts of all of the big marine species within Alaska under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that's been very, very successful. The other is that in Canada, just off the top of my mind, the beluga co-management strategy in Nunavut has been rather successful. And a lot of the researchers who are involved in that co-management process are actively looking for community members or other Indigenous researchers who are willing to live in some of the small communities. And of course, that is difficult. Not everybody wants to move to Punatuq, but I would do it and had considered doing it at a time before I decided I wanted to stay in Greenland. That being said, while there are definitely more conservation professionals nowadays, there are still more Inuit than conservation professionals, and a lot of conservation professionals still rely on our community members to do the research and monitoring that is required as part of the co-management process. And so people are very much involved in all of these things. And I would say that in general, Indigenous communities have the same measure of capacity as others to be a part of these processes.
So should I answer my question?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, I never heard that the Tajou use reindeer as a decoy. That's what you asked?
Yeah, yeah. I was reading a paper recently about the Tungus.
This is
In that area, that might have been a reference to the Tajou. It might have been a reference to a different people that I'm not aware of.
I think it's more common for tundra reindeer type herding because we're talking about taiga. They're different. Tundra in the north and taiga in the south. And I forgot to tell that the Tajou, they don't use traps. They occasionally use snares because they consider this is inhuman to use traps because this kind of hunting discriminately kill many animals and they suffer when they're in the traps. And for example, if the fox is trapped, the fox will gnaw the paw and run, but eventually it will die, it will suffer. So they view their hunting with dogs and reindeer as a human, and the resources will be reproduced because with this type of hunting you can kill like a huge amount of animals.
Thank you. We have another question for both of you from Haley, who wants to know, how do you work effectively with communities that have limited local capacity? Related to that, research fatigue is something we encounter in small communities that have been at the center of multiple research conservation efforts. Are there best practices you would recommend for these situations?
I have some thoughts about that I can share. Research fatigue is definitely a big thing in a lot of communities. I think it's really difficult to deal with once you get to that point, but there are things you can do to try and prevent that from happening. The things you can do to prevent is making sure that research is not duplicative, ensuring that community members are compensated for their work, making sure that researchers are properly asking for the correct research permits and access permits, and making things more streamlined and easy for the community members who have to deal with those researchers coming in. The other is that when research fatigue does set in, and examples of this might be like in Clyde River and Nunavut, the proper approach at that point is to respect those boundaries. And when a community says they won't be involved in something for a year or two, that community really needs that space to recuperate. And I think what this means is that the onus is on us as researchers to ensure that that doesn't happen, because when it does, there's really not a good way forward. And we have to respect what Indigenous communities want. We're going to lose a lot of research. We're going to lose a lot of opportunities to engage in policy, but that is their prerogative to decide to close off. And I think we have to respect that.
Yeah, I agree what Victoria said, but in my community situation is a little bit different because this understudied group of people, there was only two extensive research done on these people, and was done by Soviet ethnographer by Sylvian Weinstein in 1960 and by American anthropologists in the early 2000s. And I was the first indigenous scholar. So some people were very supportive, especially like elderly people, because they wanted me to help to document the knowledge, because they told me this way of life is disappearing. And some community members were very supportive. So I wouldn't say that it would be a place for research fatigue. And of course, the participants should be compensated because this is very poor province. Tuva is the poorest province in Russia, and these villages 90% of the population is unemployed, and any money, really good money for them.
Thank you. I know we are at time, but if you both have time, we have one more question for both of you. And this is from Rodrigo, who belongs to an indigenous group from the Amazon rainforest and wants to know that he observes many young people from there migrating to big cities and abandoning their culture. Does this happen in the Arctic, and does this impact the two topics that you both presented on?
Yeah, it unfortunately it happens. I think it happens everywhere. Globalization, we live in globalized world, and it happens in my community. But the people go to the from the villages, as I said, because it's a huge unemployment rate. There is no jobs, and they move to the capital for job opportunities, and another main reason to receive higher education. In Russia, the system is very different than in the Western countries. Without higher education, you cannot get a job, even if you don't have community college degree. So many people are motivated, parents, they save money to send their children to receive higher education, or at least to receive like community degree at the community college. So this is the main reason. And also another reason in my community, it's probably the only one community where indigenous population is almost 95%, 95. And people in the villages, they speak in a bad Russian. So children learn Russian only at school. So young children and elders don't speak Russian. And it's a huge problem for us because children have to take standardized, which came from the US actually. This standardized test in high school, and Russian language is really hard. So they have to send their children to the capital in order for them to learn Russian and to take this test, to pass this test, and to have higher education. There's just so many problems with this. But they have to push, because without, as I said, without degree, you will be like do only dirty job and will be receive really, really miserable salaries, where all salaries are quite miserable everywhere.
I would agree with a lot of what Tayana said. We have a few additional things here, I think, in Inuit homelands. I think decisions are made a little bit less about economy and a little bit more about sort of wanting to live the modern life that, in Inuit homelands, we belong to the lower 48. We have this idea of what the quality of life is in the US. In Canada, if you live in Nunavut, you have an idea of what the quality of life is in Canada. In Greenland, you have an idea of what the quality of life is like in Denmark. So we live in these really, really wealthy countries, but we don't have that wealth ourselves. And so when we imagine a future for ourselves, I think a lot of young people see, oh, well, I want to live a good life, I should move, even though there are jobs and opportunities that are available. The other thing is also that we're in an age where we're being more encouraged to continue on in school, to go to university. But there are actually, with the exception of Russia, because I don't really know the landscape in Russia so well, but in the other 7 Arctic countries, there are only 2 universities in indigenous homelands that teach things like natural resource management, where you can do things that feel applicable to home that are not limited to cultural studies. And of course, many people go to cultural studies. We have a great university here in Greenland. But when people want to do other things, they have to leave the country, and they're making that huge sacrifice to leave, and then they build a life in another place. And of course, you don't necessarily want to leave. So that has been difficult as well. I think the last thing that I would say is that the good news is, at least in Inuit homelands, I think also in Sami and in Russia, we're finally entering a stage or like a period in time where you're allowed to be proud to be Indigenous, and people are going back to their practices and revitalizing things that have been lost, because we're finally, it's legally acceptable and it's socially acceptable now. And so we're hoping, or I'm hoping that, as we progress into the future, that there will be more opportunities for young people to really engage with their culture and stay at home and find ways to be productive members of society that is beneficial for us as communities, but also as individuals. That would be my response, but thank you.
Thank you. And I know we are a little over our hour and a half, so we were unfortunately not able to get to all of the questions, but I just want to thank Tajana and Victoria so much for being so gracious with your time, your expertise, your experiences with everyone who was on this webinar today. As a reminder, we will have a recording of this webinar emailed out to everyone. And this webinar is a part of the Breaking the Ice Ceiling webinar series, where we are featuring over 20 women in webinars this spring and summer on things like self-determination and sustainability and Indigenous perspectives on microbial research. I hope that you will join us for some of our upcoming webinars, the next one of which is next Wednesday on Arctic Council Permanent Participant Agency and China and the Polar Silk Road. You will get a registration link in the follow-up email to this, but thank you everyone who joined us across the world. I hope you have a wonderful morning, noon, evening, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Ulula chetterdem.